Okay, so hello and welcome everyone to this session on the question how we can democratize our economies. My name is Maxine. I'm a project assistant and political economist here at das progressive Zentrum, and I very much look forward to the session because we have three very inspiring speakers who will be talking about the question how we can democratize property, finance and investment. Property, finance and investment are, of course, crucial pillars that structure how we distribute wealth, income, but also status in our societies. Yet the rule of logic that is kind of inherent to these systems has sometimes been, historically speaking, removed from democratic control or at times never been organized democratically. Therefore, this lightning talk session explores the functioning of these several core aspects of our economies, such as kind of general ownership regimes of our societies, the role of asset managers such as BlackRock and Vanguard, or the specific nature of private but also public investments and what that means for our democracies. We have three very inspiring speakers, Niklas Angebauer, Max Krahe, and Adrian Buller, who will be talking about how we can kind of overcome the greatest challenges that our societies face by democratizing our economies on the community, but also on the broader macroeconomic level. So I can imagine that all of you will be very inspired after these short inputs that each of them will give. They will be talking about 10 to 15 minutes, and then there will be a space for a short Q&A. I would invite you to be very precise and maybe quickly say your name and the organization that you're coming from so we all know who's talking. But now, to come to the fun part, let me introduce you to the first speaker, Niklas Angebauer. Niklas is a research associate at the Institute of Philosophy at the University of Oldenburg. His research focuses on social, legal, and political philosophy. And in his research, in his doctoral project, Niklas is currently attempting to reclaim property as the object of contemporary social philosophy. And in his talk, Niklas will look at the relationship between ownership and democracy more broadly and try to make a case for economic democracy from the perspective of liberal political thought, one could say. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. Niklas, the floor is yours. Please give a warm welcome.
Oh, what's happening? Here we go. Great. Yeah. Yes. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you very much. I'm particularly happy to have the opportunity to speak here today because Berlin, I think, really is right now one of the most interesting places when it comes to processes of democratization. And that's, of course, due to the recent referendum that we all know about and are excited about, I assume. This referendum, despite its title, is not really all about expropriation, but it's about democratization. It's about democratizing housing because they don't want to just take those houses away from the current owners and then give them back to the state, as you all know, but they actually want to find ways of running them, managing them in a bottom-up democratic way. So that's really exciting, and who knows, now they stand a real chance that this might actually happen. I'm a philosopher, so I'm always interested in the normative arguments that people make for their cases. And as you will know, philosophy is a fairly basic science, so my talk will be more theoretical, conceptual, and normative, and not so much empirical. We'll have that later. And we hope that this will give an interesting combination, the talks. One thing that struck me when I was following the public debate around the referendum was that there seemed to be really a divide in the rhetoric among the camps. On the one hand side, you had the property owners who were arguing that they needed to protect their freedom, the freedom of ownership against the violation by the state or the public. And then on the other side, you had, sorry, we're in the introduction. And on the other side, you had the activists and also regular people who were calling for a limitation of that freedom or that property in the name of democracy, but also justice and basic needs, mostly. So from a normative perspective, it seemed a little bit as if the choice was between either freedom and property on the one hand side, or violation or at least limitation of freedom and property in the name of justice, democracy, and so on the other. And I will try to convince you today that this strong opposition is not really true, that it's actually quite wrong. If you take property seriously, if you take the normative logic behind property seriously, then, at least that's the case I will make, you cannot really argue against democratization, you cannot argue against basic needs or against justice. And on the other hand side, if you fight for those three, the idea of property might actually be a good ally. I will make this case today focusing on the issue of democracy, but I think it could be made with respect to the other values as well. So what I want to do is, in a first step, here we go. In the first step, I want to discuss the shared roots of property and democracy, what they have in common, what they what is shared between the two of them, and then I will discuss how to reconcile property and democracy, again, from normative and conceptual perspective. And there's really three options that are typically discussed in that context, that is the welfare state, property-owning democracy, or economic democracy, and I will argue for the latter, that only the latter can really make up for a true reconciliation between property and democracy. So here we go. If we look at the history of ideas, then we find that property and democracy are actually not really opposed to each other, but rather are closely connected. They really are two parts of a solution to the same problem. And that problem is really how to be free, the problem of freedom, how to be free in the light of limited resources and other agents who also claim their freedom, of course. How is it possible for me to live self-determinately given those restraints? And very, very roughly, this is just a rough sketch. The solution to that problem is, on the one hand side, of course, property. Property is roughly answering that question by making a case of mutual non-interference. So this is yours, this is mine, and we'll leave each other alone, and we will all live happily ever after. If you recognize my property claims, I will recognize yours. But the question, of course, immediately arises: is what is a property claim? What amounts to a claim? Who can claim property? Property in what, and so on. So this isn't really a solution on its own, but it needs to be accompanied, and it is accompanied by democracy. Because one possibility would be to say, well, all these questions that I just raised, what is a property claim, what can we have property in, how much, and so on, could be decided, say, by a dictator or by a leader, then it would be all said and all clear. But the problem of freedom would, of course, remain. We would still be unfree because we would be subjugated to a leader. So this old idea of Hobbes that you will perhaps know, the Leviathan, doesn't do the job. What does do the job is democracy. In Rousseau's famous definition, democracy is a form of association in which each, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain as free as before. And this is a puzzle at first, remaining free as before, and at the same time reuniting with other people. How is that possible? Rousseau's insight is the idea of collective self-determination. If we follow rules that we have given ourselves, we remain free, and if we follow rules that we have given ourselves altogether, then we remain free altogether. That's very, very roughly the idea, and of course the core of democracy. It implies, by the way, that freedom, well understood, or no, the other way around, that democratic rules and laws, well understood, are not an opposition of freedom, but actually an expression of freedom, normatively speaking. So to sum this first part up, at their core, both property and democracy are concerned with the same problem, that is how to live freely in the light of those restraints I just mentioned. Property and democracy clearly are different parts of the solution to this problem, but still they remain parts of the solution to the same problem. So there is a strong connection between the two of them through the notion of freedom. However, property and democracy, as we all know, and as the referendum is a witness of, come into conflict all the time. So what happens then? This brings us to the next part. So despite trying to solve the same problem, property and democracy constantly come into conflict with one another. And I think the examples of that are so obvious that I don't even need to mention them. There is a certain trade-off between the two of them, because the more property gets concentrated, the worse it is for democracy, generally speaking. That's because economic inequality of citizens undermines their political equality, and political equality, of course, is a condition of possibility for democracy. So, as we know, it's a very, very rough sketch, and I think we will hear about the specifics of how that works later, but we all know that economic power translates into political power, or can be translated into political power. And on the other hand, if you're poor, then you cannot just be effectively excluded from participating in democratic practices, but you also tend to gain a low expectation of self-efficacy, which then starts a vicious circle, because if I don't think that I can change anything, then I won't even try, and so on. So that's the problem that is really at hand here. So given those conflicts, which are really obvious, how could democracy and property be reconciled with one another on a conceptual level? That's a very classical question of political philosophy, and modern political philosophy has come up with roughly 3 solutions, or maybe 5 solutions, but I will only consider the 3 central ones. Those solutions are called the welfare state, property-owning democracy, and economic democracy. And I want to talk and walk you quickly through them. So starting with the welfare state, which is of course most well known to us all, the idea of the welfare state is really to stabilize a capitalist property order by mitigating its worst effects and by securing everyone a social minimum. The instrument to do so is a redistribution of produced wealth. So the state allows property owners to appropriate the lion's share of the generated products, but it reallocates some of this income that is produced to the worst off. The owners are awarded full control rights and most of the profit rights or income, and the others get a few of the profit rights. This, however, means simply that the idea of the welfare state doesn't even really try to solve the constant conflict between, or resolve at least the conflict between property and democracy in a robust way. It basically just mitigates it and doesn't try to solve the bigger bigger conflict between the two of them. The standard criticism here is Rawls's, who says that this welfare state permits very large inequalities in the ownership of real property, and so that the control of the economy and much of political life rests in few hands. And Rawls, of course, has developed an alternative, which he calls property-owning democracy. So let's look how this does in resolving the conflict between property and democracy. So yeah, that was the picture of what the welfare state is actually doing. Property-owning democracy has a different instrument. It doesn't redistribute socially produced wealth, but it actually distributes or pre-distributes or ex-ante distributes the means of production, the possibility to create wealth. That's a big step forward because or yeah, I will come to that in a minute, but this dispersion of capital is not meant to make everyone equally rich, of course. It's just meant to, again, mitigate the worst effects and to, as Rawls says, prevent a small part of society from controlling the economy and indirectly political life as well. So sometimes Rawls is really portrayed as a thinker of the welfare state, but he's really not. So he's really not. Also, even the early Rawls, you find it all over the place if you look for it. He's not a welfarist and has been misunderstood often. There have been different ideas or proposals of what a property-owning democracy might actually looks like, because Rawls sadly hasn't exactly told us what it specifically looks like. So Piketty, for example, has thought into that direction. John Römer has thought into that direction. Very roughly, the idea is that in a society, or imagine that we have a society where all big companies are distribute shares, and the idea is just to give everyone a share, say by a capital endowment on your 25th birthday or something like that, so that you can buy the shares of the companies you like, and by that, if the company is profitable, then that distributes the income all over society. So what we have here is, if we take that at least together with a few other background institutions of Rawls, progressive taxes, inheritance tax mostly, then this is really a significant step towards the reconciliation between of property and democracy. However, there is again a however, and there's a picture, but I'm running too quick. I'm sorry, you have to wait for the picture for a moment. However, just like the welfare state model that we discussed earlier on, a property-owning democracy, at least as it's typically envisioned, is primarily concerned with profit rights, so with distributing income. But giving everyone a share isn't necessarily the same as giving everyone a say. And of course, being a shareholder of a company gives you some control over the company behind that share. But still, the model leaves intact most of the incentive structure of modern companies. And the fact remains that most people will work in companies that are owned and controlled by distant shareholders. So that is a problem. At least some argue that this is a problem. Is it possible to read that? Imagine living under a dictator for more than 40 hours per week. It says. Why is that a problem, or why isn't that a good solution or resolution of the conflict we're talking about? In her recent book, Private Government, Elizabeth Anderson has developed a powerful language that renders visible why this arbitrary rule at work that is so normal for us by the absent shareholders is actually highly problematic. She presents a long list of things superiors can rightfully do towards their employees in the US, both at work and at off hours. And she then provocatively asks us what we would think about those things if they were done to us not by our bosses, but by our government. And the result of this comparison is staggering. Here is Elizabeth Anderson. She says, most workers in the United States are governed by communist dictatorships in their work lives. So that's the result of this comparison. This might be a bit of an exaggeration, yes, sure, even for the US. But I think the point Anderson wants to make here is really clear and valid. We would never accept a government to exercise a comparable degree of control over our lives as we do and have grown accustomed to with our employers. But if we fight fiercely against subjugation in the political realm, why should we accept the same subjugation in the economic realm? So why opposing dictators but not CEOs, if you wish, if they both end up undermining or threatening our freedom? So this is what brings us to the third part, the idea of economic democracy. And this is why property-owning democracy in itself cannot be enough for a true reconciliation, normatively speaking, of property and democracy. Rawls' reconciliation remains incomplete because it leaves most people under the arbitrary rule of their superiors and their superiors and so on for about 1/3 of their lifetime. That's apparently roughly the time we spend working these days. So the true reconciliation, or a true reconciliation between property and democracy, must go one step further, must go one step beyond Rawls. This brings us finally to the third model, economic democracy. Just like the second model, the tool of the instrument of an economic democracy is an ex-ante distribution or pre-distribution. But this time, the major companies are not just owned by anyone who buys those shares, but by the workers of those companies themselves. There's a huge debate, again, how transition is possible and how best to institutionalize this, and perhaps we can come back to that later in the discussion. But very roughly, the common denominator of economic democracy is that first, neither profit rights nor control rights are awarded to outsiders, at least never a majority of those rights. And second, that the major decisions are made democratically by the workforce. And third, that the company's profit, if there is any, remains with the workforce. So that's it, pretty much. Brings us to the conclusion. Here are my 4 take-home messages. The first, property and democracy are complementary. Only together can they solve the problem of freedom. And that implies that every attempt to, say, argue against the referendum by saying, oh, these are our sacred property rights and so on, actually is based on the idea of freedom. And if you take freedom seriously, then it can actually be used as a case for democratization rather than against it. That's the whole punchline of this talk. Then second, property is not just about income or profit, or profit rights, as it is often seen, as e.g. by the property owning democracy camp. It is also about control. And if we want to democratize control and profits, it's just not enough to only share the income or distribute the income more equally. Instead, what is needed is actually a widely shared, equalized distribution of both income and control. That's what economic democracy is all about, and perhaps the referendum that we've seen is a small but significant step towards it. Let's hope for it. Thank you very much.
Niklas, thank you very much for this very inspiring and insightful talk. I think it was a very interesting case to develop a case for economic democracy from a liberal, immanent standpoint. I guess the Free Democratic Party in Germany could learn from that, for instance. While all of you can already think of some questions that you want to ask Niklas, maybe you can also continue to stand here if you want to. Exactly. Maybe I can pose the first question to you, because what I was wondering is, why did you choose to develop this case for economic democracy from a liberal standpoint? I mean, there are also other thinkers, such as Eva von Redeker, who maybe take a little bit more an approach from a critical theory perspective, stressing the also like exploitative character of property itself. So maybe you could comment a little bit on that.
That's an excellent question. Yeah, thank you very much. I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I think it is the more external critique has very valid points, and life is not just all about freedom. There's also other values. So I don't see an opposition here, or necessary opposition. This is really more meant as a as a different angle, as an angle of a more immanent critique. To have not just opposition, like oppositional rhetorics all the time, and then say like we're the freedom guys and we're the justice guys, and then we have this standoff, but actually like entering that liberal sphere of freedom and say like, look, if you take seriously what you say, then you cannot mean what you say. That's the whole point. And like I don't think this solves all problems. It clearly doesn't, but I think it's a helpful tool. And one which has hadn't been or has been underdeveloped, I believe, in at least in philosophical debate recently. So that's why I try to choose this path.
Who wants to ask a question? Oh wow, a lot of questions. Okay, so do you want to answer every question separately, or do you want to collect? Okay. Yeah, so maybe you can just say.
Hi, I'm Perry Walker. My organisation is Talkshop. I'm not a philosopher. When I was listening to you, I was thinking about whether property rights could be disaggregated or unbundled. And the specific example that came to me was the land value taxation proposed by Henry George, in which property owners would have the right to benefit from improvements, but not from overall changes in the property market. Would that be a simple proposal that would help your case?
Yes, I'll come back to that in a minute.
Another question? Yeah. Wait, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. My question is whether the concept of trade unions and how they work and how they fight for more wage is like a starting point for the last model of economic democracy. If trade unions and their role in arguing for a share of workers is a part or is an example for how economic the last model could work like.
Yes, thank you for those excellent questions. Henry George, yes, absolutely. And I think that is actually, so this is what I do in the bigger part of the project. This is just like a one side of it, or one side project. The case you made is precisely right, I believe. Again, if we take the liberal standpoint, then property is valuable because it protects freedom. And how does it protect freedom? Because it protects what I have created with my own arms and with my own genius ideas and so on, right? But if you take that idea seriously, then you can say, like, capitalism is not a viable option for a property order that takes itself seriously, because capitalism is based on the idea of violating this precise principle, because it's about rents, it's about generating rents, it's about generating profits from ecosystems which one hasn't produced. It's about, as you said, profiting or benefiting from land price increases and so on. So whenever there's a genuine improvement, yes, there can be made a case for private property. That makes sense. That's the core of property. But where there isn't, there shouldn't be a property claim, at least not a private one. And yeah, so this is the normative argument behind it. So thank you for that question. I think it's exactly the right direction. On the question of trade union, it sounds like an interesting or a simple question, but it's not. I discussed that with someone from IG Metall yesterday, and I think there is. I struggle to give a definite answer to it. I mean, on the one hand side, of course, yes, it's about fighting for not just money, but also more control. Like Mitbestimmung, co-determination, I think, is also about democratizing the workplace. However, of course, it's also stabilizing capitalist modes of production and accepting capitalist mode of production. So I think even inside the workers' unions, as far as I know them, it depends on which union we're talking about, perhaps. But there is a lot of tension, which really revolves around the question you've raised. Is this actually fighting for democracy, or is it stabilizing anti-democratic practices? And I think it's hard to say in general. It depends really on the agenda, on how you do it, and on what you aim for. But I mean, the IG Metall, for example, at least in their statutes, they still say that they want the socialization of core industries, right? So if they, again, imminent critique, if they take themselves seriously, then perhaps they could be a definite force for economic democracy, yes.
Cool, thank you. Maybe two more questions. We would have time for that. Okay, yes.
I don't think I needed mine.
I think we need it for the recording.
Okay. Thanks a lot for this philosophical framework. I'm also not a philosopher. I was wondering if you might be able to offer a few practice examples of economic democracy in action. If it's not in the form of trade unions, do you have any cases where this has already been put in place, and what does it look like?
Excellent.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm Matthew Lawrence, work for an organisation called Commonwealth, which very much works on like box 3, so very much support that. But I wonder whether in the politics of achieving box 3, we need to take sort of box 1 a bit more seriously. So to flesh out what I mean, in 2019, in the lips of UK general election, the Labour Party had a proposal called the Inclusive Ownership Fund, which was very much about transferring both income and control rights from external shareholders to the sort of demos of the company workforce. And it was both sort of popular in general polling, but it was ferociously attacked in sort of the FT and the Economist and various other sort of, pro-capital papers as an attack on pensioners and pension income, et cetera, et cetera. And so I wonder whether sort of stressing the need to decommodify and extend social provision, i.e. box 1, is actually key to unlocking the politics of box 3 as well.
Yeah, two more excellent questions. On the first one, I'm not an expert there yet, so I have to do more work on to see on which factors it actually depends. I don't have to do the work; I have to do the reading, I guess, because I'm not working empirically. But I mean, Mondragon is always the prime example. Is one of the biggest. Companies in Spain, and it has a lot of workplace democracy principles involved. So it's a Genossenschaft. So in general, Genossenschaften, they are not all the same. It all depends on how they are built. But so like associations or whatever that translates to would be a generally good example. In power Bürgerwerke and so on are other examples. There's currently also the debate on the idea of Verantwortungseigentum, another term that is hard to translate. Sorry? Steward-owned companies, thank you. Again, it depends very much on how this is built, really. But there are some companies already here in Berlin, for example, Neue Narrative or Einhorn, the condom producers, who use different models of ownership with and combine that with workplace democracy, or holacracy, as it's often called. It's not basic democracy, so you don't always have to ask everyone what they want to do, but it's a bit more efficient than that. But so yeah, there are tons of different models that you can use, and it's really a question of experimenting. And it depends really on the field where you're working. I think it's a different thing if you're into housing and then if you're into producing consumer goods, and again into other things. And the last, sorry, may I? I think you're right. I mean, this was the normative case, and the case of transformation is distinct from that. I think this is what one should aim for. And one should be very careful not to make false compromises on the way in order not to get stuck. But of course, pushing the limit in the right direction is always a good thing, I think. So I'm not a catastrophist who wants to things to be horrible in order for them to get better. And this is a spectrum that I gave you. It's really not clear cases, but it's a spectrum, and I think pushing in the right direction is really the way to go.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Niklas. Okay, with our next speaker, we will be zooming out a little bit to the macroeconomic level again, looking at how the ownership structure of our economies has been radically transformed from an empirical point of view. And our next speaker, Adrian Buller, is an expert in all of this. Adrian is a senior research fellow at the think tank Commonwealth in the UK. Her work focuses on the intersection of the financial system and the climate and nature crises. She's the author of the forthcoming The Value of a Whale with Manchester University Press and Owning the Future, Power and Property in the Age of Crisis. And in her talk, Adrian introduces us to the consequences of asset and power accumulation in the hands of big asset managers such as BlackRock or Vanguard. Yeah, Adrian, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I don't have fancy slides, so hopefully I can keep your attention without them. So I think Niklas set up actually what I'll talk about really well in describing basically, in the abstract, the consequences of lacking in economic democracy. And I basically want to talk about the ways in which empirically that has happened in the global economy to date. So just before I get into that, I want everyone to picture basically that you live in a nation state in which 3 sort of fat cat individuals have control of about 20% of the vote on anything that you decide, whether it's a referendum on housing or, elected officials. And then subsequently imagine that those same 3 individuals have 1/5 of the vote of every country in the entire world. Obviously, it doesn't seem like a particularly democratic system, but when it comes to the global economy, that is, in a lot of ways, the reality. So at this point in time, we have sort of 3 vast asset management firms, primarily located in the US, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street to a lesser extent. And together they control, 20% of pretty much every S&P 500 company. So that's your Exxon, Amazon, Facebook, and everything in between. And that level of control is only accelerating and also spreading throughout pretty much every industry, every asset class, and every geography in the global economy. This has significant implications for economic democracy and basically for the governance of our daily lives, because it may not sound like a large number in the abstract, 20%, but it ultimately comes down to effectively a veto power at the decision-making processes of all of the world's corporations. And ultimately, that's what ends up governing our lives. So BlackRock, for example, in 2020 alone, they participated in over 160,000 votes at 17,000 different corporate annual general meetings, which is just like a phenomenal degree of influence. And again, that's spread over everything from fossil fuel industry to big tech to any industry that you can name. So in a lot of ways, this is governance, and they're doing it. And they're so influential, in fact, that they now sort of have spilled over into being the 4th branch of the American government, as a couple of Bloomberg journalists called them, insofar as, the belief in their unique expertise and opinions now entitles them to direct participation in governance itself. So a number of BlackRock alumni are now in prominent positions in the Biden administration, for example, as the chief of the Economic Council, Kamala Harris is chief economic advisor. They were also given the mandate to carry out the Federal Reserve's COVID response asset purchase program, during which they bought up a number of their own funds. And they were selected by the European Commission to consult on the sustainable finance regulation that would govern their own activities. So clearly there's a lot of spillover here, and these are entities that we need to be paying close attention to if we care about a democratic economy in any real sense. So given that, it's worth asking, what do they want? An important question, and so I will ask all of you to join me in trying to think like Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock. And I'll sort of wind back before we do that to say that, as Niklas pointed out, property is really composed of 2 things, which is the rights to sort of income and then the rights to governance and control. And in a system of asset management, we've effectively disaggregated those 2 rights. So while the rights to income remain with the ultimate beneficiary, so someone with a pension or anyone with kind of a savings fund, all of the rights to control have been handed over to the financial intermediary, so BlackRock, which is why they get to have all those votes. Now, the justification for allowing shareholders to have voting rights as they do, in a lot of senses, has been made based on the assumptions of a distribution of ownership that definitely doesn't exist anymore, if it ever did. So when someone like Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan advocated a shareholder democracy as part of sort of the advent of neoliberalism and all the promise that it supposedly held, they envisioned a system in which you had incredibly diffuse ownership, and it would in some way represent a quasi-democratic system. Evidently, that's not what's happened insofar as we have enormous concentration of ownership and therefore control rights. So now I'll try and bring us back into thinking like BlackRock, what is it that they want? And this comes down to a historically unprecedented combination of sort of characteristics of their ownership. So the first is that the industry itself, as I said before, is highly concentrated. Second, they have strong positions in virtually every aspect of the economy. So strong being, a 5-6% kind of stake, which is far greater than anything that a Thatcher would imagine when it comes to shareholder democracy. The third aspect is that they operate on a fee basis. So that sounds really obvious, but unlike a not-for-profit pension fund, which might in theory make decisions based on the interests of its beneficiaries, BlackRock is interested solely in growing the scale of the assets under its management in the aggregate. So it doesn't really care if Elon Musk tweets something and Tesla's share price is cut in half, provided that in aggregate, the economy continues to grow and its assets under management grow. And that's because, as the final trait, they are universal. So as a universal investor, it's exactly what it sounds like. They are distributed across the entire economy. So what matters to them exclusively is sort of aggregate asset price inflation. And basically, that kind of premise has led some people to say that universal ownership, there's sort of a large class of people who believe that universal ownership holds a lot of promise insofar as if you are interested in the size of your assets growing as a whole, then in theory you should be interested in systemic risks like the climate crisis. You should be interested in anything that would, in aggregate, cause a hit to the economy. And intuitively that theory makes a lot of sense, and quite a lot of civil society groups advocate on it. And it does make sense, BlackRock doesn't want to do something with one company that will directly affect the profits elsewhere. Where I think that falls down and where I think we need to sort of move farther to get to a system of economic democracy is that the original formulators of universal ownership theory have a quote which says, and again, this was predicated on a system of pension fund ownership back in the day, and basically said there is effectively no conceivable situation in which the interests of pensioners do not reflect those of society. And that is sort of the underlying tenet, because most Americans were implicated in the pension system. It was relatively diffuse at the time. But I think in reality, all of us can understand that that is simply no longer the case. So there are several inherent inequalities in who is represented, even by a universal owner, that mean that BlackRock's interests really aren't universal in any true sense. So the first being that obviously pension assets are incredibly unequally held, so people with participation in financial markets through assets are actually relatively few and far between, even within a country like the UK, for example, where the top 10% of the wealth bracket has half of all pension assets, and it's even more extreme in the US. The second is that when we think about societal interests, the vast majority of the world's population exists outside of countries in which they have significant financial market participation. So even if within the UK you were representing the interests of an entire society based on their financial asset ownership, there are several futures in which you could make decisions that are universally beneficial to that cohort of people. For example, on the climate crisis, you could make decisions that effectively decarbonize Germany while just putting up the walls of Fortress Europe and disregarding the interests of everyone whose assets you don't represent. And the third is this sort of chronological or temporal frame, which is that, if the interests of pensions are the interests of society, then the question is, are those the interests of the people who are about to realize their pension fund, or are they the interests of myself who just entered into the fund? And very clearly, I have different interests and different time horizons than someone who's about to retire. So for all of these reasons, I think that the sort of BlackRock utopia universal ownership question is one that doesn't actually hold. So putting that aside, the question then becomes, if we have an economy that is defined by these entities with world-shaping power, enormous influence over government, over capital allocation, and all of these things, how can we actually sort of democratize the economy. And there are sort of two ways, and I'll call them the sort of lean in and lean out solutions. So the lean in solutions would be basically to say, you know, look at the financial system as it currently exists. What are the tools that are already present within it that we can harness for our own benefit? So this starts from very basic, which is, you know, often a rallying cry, which is to democratize pensions and just give actual people who are pensioners a vote. But for the reasons we just discussed, obviously that's only a very, very early stepping stone. So the next would be, I think, and this again touches on a little bit of what Niklas spoke about, which is actually building up ex-ante public wealth. So whether that's something like the Inclusive Ownership Fund, which my boss, Matt, mentioned at the back, or something a little bit more ambitious like sort of people's asset manager, so someone who effectively is a public utility alternative to BlackRock, who is democratically accountable with all sorts of mandates on how they should invest and who they should represent, representatives from, you know, supply chains or people outside of a demos. And then the last would be, I think, a lean out solution, which for me is to step back and say, again, touching on what Niklas did philosophically, you know, why is it that we have afforded shareholders the rights to govern the corporation? Why is it that the disciplining force of the corporation is based on, you know, very tertiary, distal financial shareholders? And to basically, given that we've already disaggregated rights to income and control, to just take that one step further and remove the control element altogether from shareholding, particularly in publicly listed corporations, and to transfer that over to you know, the actual participants in the firm itself. So whether that's sort of worker ownership or some other kind of model. And I think only then will we begin to actually sort of redistribute the governance and control of the corporation, which remains, you know, the ultimate driving force of the economy, but also the ultimate driving force of climate crisis, inequality, and all sorts of other ills. And that is it for me for now.
Stay here. Thank you so much, Adrian. Wow, that was like a quick ride through the structural changes of how we moved from one mode of capitalism to asset manager capitalism now. I think before I give the word again to you, one first question maybe. So you mentioned this lean in and lean out pathway, so to say, that you just mentioned. I was wondering, maybe there is also a third aspect of how democracy and asset management kind of conflicts with each other, how it is currently running. And that is regarding maybe also the specific business model of asset managers. So some of you might know this software called Aladdin by this big asset manager, BlackRock. And I was wondering, what role does data extraction in this business model also play with regards to the consequences for democracy?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very interesting question. And yeah, so there's a whole other layer that, in the interest of brevity, I didn't touch on in the original talk, which is that first, you know, BlackRock is an asset manager, but it's also several other things. So it provides the platform Aladdin, which Maxine just mentioned, which is a risk management software, which about a fifth of global assets are managed on. So what that means is that it helps people make, whether you're BlackRock or not, investment allocation decisions. And there's about $22 trillion worth of assets worldwide that operate using that platform and that are allocated based on a model that is ultimately decided by in-house BlackRock nerds. And that's not just the case for Aladdin. The other thing that's really important about the advent of asset manager capitalism is that the incredibly rapid ascent and growth of groups like BlackRock and Vanguard has been predicated on passive investment. So many of you in this room probably know what that is, but effectively you invest based on a predetermined index, which is decided not by necessarily, you know, manager speculation or thinking like, you know, this seems like a good company, but instead it is based on, you know, criteria like market capitalization or some kind of objective trait like that. And index investing is absolutely enormous in terms of how capital is now allocated. And it's even less democratic than the asset management system itself, insofar as I believe 3/4 of index provision is done by just a handful of firms, so FTSE Russell, MSCI, S&P Dow Jones, and so they actually have an enormous amount of influence that's absolutely opaque and behind closed doors as to how capital is allocated in the economy. And then they're sort of followed by BlackRock, which through its iShares products, which is its in-house kind of index tracking funds, again, make enormous decisions over how capital is allocated, not just their own investments, but for everybody else in the industry as well. You know, where BlackRock goes, others follow. People track their indices. Everyone's tracking the same kind of thing. And, you know, that would be fine, I suppose, if it was just a useful sort of mechanism for people to make investment decisions and do it at a lower cost so that, you know, more people can access investing in the financial system. But the reality is that indexes don't just sort of track the market. In a lot of ways, they make and shape them. And you know, the index effect is so called because when a company is added to or dropped from an index, or there's even speculation that that might happen, it can wildly affect, you know, its share price, whether it's able to access debt finance and all sorts of other decisions. And so, you know, a bunch of analysts sitting behind closed doors at the MSCI offices can make or break, you know, a country's COVID response. You know, the Argentinian index shot up 6% when it was moved from like an emerging market to a separate category and then back. You know, these are real world decisions that are sort of not arbitrarily, but sort of very opaquely made, that have a lot of overlap with how capital is managed as well, and that basically have incredibly undemocratic world-making kind of force through how they allocate investment in the economy.
Excellent, thank you so much. Now I would open up the space again for your questions. Who wants to go first? I can imagine that there are a lot of questions, no? Maybe I give you a few more seconds to think about it. I mean, it was also... Yes.
Super, amazing. This was a brilliant talk and will give me things to think about for a long time. I'm wondering, asset capitalism was the term that we just used. Is this still capitalism in the old sense, or isn't that almost like a planning economy? So I wonder whether this affects the categories that we typically use to analyze those products, whether it has already arrived at the threshold where we can no longer speak of markets, properly speaking, or the opposition of central planning versus markets and so on. So is this really a new kind of, is this a game changer in that respect as well?
Yeah, and I'll probably have Max follow up on this because this is one of his favorite questions. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the very least, it's definitely not free market capitalism in any sense of the word whatsoever. I mean, you're really in a state of quite a high degree of economic planning, but it's just entirely unaccountable, or at least accountable to very, very few people. I think it's absolutely a game changer in my perspective, insofar as it's totally historically unprecedented, the kind of convergence of all of these traits surrounding how things are owned and by whom in the economy. I'm not sure what I would term it insofar as an economic system. I think it's quite nascent, and none of us really understand what it implies in terms of how the economy is governed. But it's definitely an enormous departure from basically all of the assumptions and frameworks that underlie, you know, justifications for the way that we allocate property rights in the economy, or the way we allocate governance. And yeah, absolutely, it's a complete rupture with basically any kind of historical precedent.
I think I saw a question there.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's fascinating. I'm not an economist, I have to say, but I was really interested in the in the recommendations you gave, and I was just thinking about, because it's such a global governance issue, who would be the target groups that you would, you know, point the recommendations towards, because I feel that even at the national level, if you have economists sitting in the parliaments, I'm not sure they would be able to do something about it. So is it the IMF? Can the ECB do something? And, you know, who would be able to change that system?
Do you want to comment on that immediately or collect? Okay. Who had another question? There was, I think, one other hand. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Great.
So this is, I think, a bit of a two-part answer, one of which is like the sort of near-term pragmatic one, and one of which is more the kind of idealist one. And the first is that the unfortunate reality of global financial markets is that the vast majority of transactions are occurring in two places, and that's Manhattan and the City of London. And so if you are able to enact changes in either of those jurisdictions, effectively you change the rules for everyone. And so those are the two sort of absolute pinch points in how financial markets are governed. There's an academic called Katerina Pistor who does a really interesting chapter on this in her book, The Code of Capital, and talks about basically how the laws of New York State and the City of London affect the entirety of the global economy. So I'd highly recommend looking at that to understand what the leverage points are. But from a sort of more, a more ambitious perspective, ultimately, this comes down to a world in which we have radical redistribution of wealth and control, right? So I would love there to not need to be a massive change in the legal structure of the New York and British, financial regulations, because I'd love to see a world in which, ownership and control of the global economy is not nearly so violently concentrated. And so ultimately this comes down to people all over the world advocating for enormous redistribution of wealth and control, which is obviously a lofty goal. But in the abstract, I think, that's what it ultimately comes down to.
Wonderful. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. Excuse me. All that I knew about BlackRock until before your talk was that they had lost some extraordinary amount of money investing in fossil fuels. I don't 10 billion, 100, who knows. Is there any benefit to having something the size of BlackRock because it magnifies the impact of decisions like that?
I guess I would wonder benefit to whom? To campaigners against investment in fossil. Yeah, I mean, absolutely, they provide a useful target, but also the decisions that BlackRock makes absolutely do amplify any kind of trend that you might otherwise see. So that is a really good example where there was a study that basically said that they effectively destroyed, I think, 90 billion or something in value over a decade because fossil fuel indices or fossil fuel companies trailed the overall growth of a major index by X amount. I think that's absolutely true. I think the more interesting part there is less about BlackRock and more about the role that index providers have. Again, I'll return to the sort of infrastructural power that they have. BlackRock, anytime those kinds of arguments are raised, whether they've destroyed value or people, attack them for remaining invested in fossil fuels or in thermal coal or in all those things, their response tends to be, we don't actually have a right to this decision. It's determined by this index that we've purchased. We don't have an exit option, and all those kinds of things. So I think ultimately the really interesting player there is the person who's constructing an index on supposedly objective criteria, and the fact that the vast majority of the world subscribes to those with very little scrutiny. But yeah.
Okay, so if there is no other question, I would love to thank Adrian again for this very inspiring talk. I think we have a lot of food for thought after this. But there is another very interesting and inspiring speaker who I would love to introduce to you now. His name is Max Krahe. Max is a political economist and political theorist who is, I think he would say, historically oriented, and he's working primarily on North America and Western Europe since the Bretton Woods. And he's currently a postdoc at the Institute for Socioeconomics at the University of Duisburg-Essen, and there he coordinates the PhD program, The Political Economy of Inequality. And apart from that, he's also the co-founder of Dezerner Zukunft, a German macro finance think tank, and is its research director. Yes, welcome on stage, Max.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you for the very generous introduction, for organizing this whole conference. You can't see the slides, which is fine, because I made the slides thinking I was going to give one talk, and now I'm going to give a different talk. And if we get to see them, I'll skip right to the last slide, because this one takes off where the last one would have finished. So I'm as a researcher and then as kind of a think tanker, I'm interested in the kind of the nitty-gritty, the implementation of big ideas. Fantastic. And so when we're talking about finance and democracy, I'm really interested in, we'll skip all of this. Okay, boom. Done. Okay, perfect. Very different talk coming up. When we talk about democracy and finance, these are two complicated things, and so for me the big question is, what does this look like in practice? And I was going to break this down by saying, look, democracy is all about will formation. It's about us coming together to agree what we want to do in kind of our shared life world, and then we need to find ways to realize that will in the world, to kind of adapt the world, change the world so it looks more like the world that we've collectively agreed we're going to work towards. And I want to talk about an area, sustainable finance, where I think the will formation is in many ways already complete. Certainly in Europe, the first slide I was going to show tells you that if you do some surveys, basically everyone in Europe, 90% of people agree that climate change is a problem, we need to do something about it. And so then you then move on to the kind of the second part of will formation and implementation. And the big question is, well, what do you do in the area of finance to realize this kind of will of doing something about climate change? But then over dinner yesterday and in the conversations at the conference here today, I thought, that's not that interesting. Because setting up the talk that way would have meant, okay, I'm going to tell you why that kind of implementation bit is complicated and why it gets challenging and why you really need to kind of pay attention to the nitty-gritty. And that ultimately would have been kind of a story of, let's reflect and think and be cautious. But really the kind of atmosphere I'm getting here and the kind of message I want to send out is we should be ambitious. We should be out there doing things, changing stuff. And I think the way to that message is to look at the kind of lower, the last line of the last slide, which says, look, how we come to shape our intentions, the kind of discussions we have and the kinds of intentions we form, that really depends on what tools we think we have in hand. If you have a toolkit full of kind of trusted, reliable, powerful tools, you're going to be ambitious in the discussion where you decide what you want to do with those tools, all right? So, curiously enough, talking about the tools and kind of outlining what tools we have and how we can use them, I think allows us to be much more ambitious on the deciding what we want to do front. Okay. So with that background, I wanted to give a very quick run over of what I think are the two basic mechanisms in play when we talk about democratizing finance. Right? Democratizing finance, huge theme, very nebulous sometimes, but at the risk of slight simplification and slight inaccuracies, I think we can really boil down the democratization of finance to two simple kind of mechanisms and then how you change them. To get to that point, ask yourself, what does a financial system do? Really, there are two tasks that a financial system discharges in its operation. One is you allocate capital. And that's fairly straightforward. There are a bunch of projects out there. Maybe some of you want to start a new company, some of you want to buy houses, sell houses, and projects go ahead when there's enough cash to implement them, right? I would love to buy an apartment in Berlin. Sadly, I don't have the cash to do so. Depending on how the financial system allocates capital, I might get lucky and I might get, €500,000 or whatever it takes. And then with that capital, I can realize my project of kind of home ownership. Fantastic. That's kind of one task. And of course, given, same as kind of Niklas said at the beginning, given limited resources, this allocative task always means some things happen, some things don't happen. First task, allocation. Second task is a bit more complicated, although it's something that I think today we can talk about in a way that we couldn't have talked about 10 years ago. The second task of finance is co-deciding how much capital there is in an economy. So, we used to think, or at least the way that economics was taught when I was an undergrad, about 10, 15 years ago was that there's a kind of a pre-existing amount of savings, and then those savings get channeled into these projects, and so really the kind of task of allocation is really all there is to finance. But then today, with the rise of MMT and kind of rise to prominence of post-Keynesian economics, we've come to realize that actually the amount of capital in an economy is really quite variable. And it can be a lot, it can be little. The kind of Piketty book, the Capital in the 21st Century, shows that it varied from about 300% of GDP just after World War II to now 700%. So this is it's a variable thing, and we can make decisions about kind of how much leverage we want to have, how much capital we want to have in our economy, and how little. And so that second task I call modulation, following what's his name, Robert Hockett, an American legal scholar. He kind of has a nice phrase on this. And he kind of says that this is about modulating the amount of capital in an economy. So if allocation, modulation. Given that there are kind of these two tasks, democratizing them really just means you need to understand how they operate in the world, and then you can change how they operate in the world, and that allows you to then realize kind of democratic preferences in the world. And the way that capital allocation works is pretty straightforward. It's about interest rates and availability of credit for different projects, right? So coming back to the project of home ownership, given who I am, kind of my financial background, color of my skin, my gender, various things, they all play a role. I will be offered a certain interest rate if I come to a bank with a project of home ownership, and that'll kind of different for different people. The kind of the financial term for this is that there are different spreads. So depending on who you are, depending on what the project is, the kind of offer you will get is kind of more expensive than a reference interest rate. And so democratizing the allocation of capital really just means influencing the different spreads that exist between all the different projects that are out there. And in the Q&A, maybe we can talk about what the actual tools are that you would use to influence these spreads. And there are a bunch of different ones. You can kind of go to the central bank collateral framework, you can go to banking regulation, you can go to direct public credit provision, you can go to kind of more credit guidance type stuff, but don't get confused by all the different details. Really, you're doing one thing and one thing only. You're influencing the spreads between different projects in the economy. And again, it's not that complicated. All you're doing is kind of influencing, this project gets that interest rate, this project gets a higher interest rate, we don't like it, that project we really like, we're going to push for a lower interest rate. It's not rocket science. You just need to have kind of a clear understanding of what sort of projects you want to prioritize, push down the interest rate, which ones you want to kind of slow down, you make it more expensive, you push up the interest rate, and then the economy in its kind of different ways is going to implement that, realize that. And so you might say, look, that's what I was going to talk about originally today. If you can identify sustainable projects, push down the interest rate on those, everything else you push it up. The second task, modulation, is a bit more complicated. Because credit creation happens all over the economy, in the private sector, also in the public sector. And so if you change it in one area, you may or may not change the total depending on what happens elsewhere. But generally speaking, credit modulation, all you do is, if you're the public sector, you issue more debt. If you're the central bank and you want kind of more credit to be created in the private sector, you lower interest rates, and that kind of creates more capital, higher leverage. Before concluding, I'll say one other thing, which is a bit more of a note of caution, because I think we shouldn't take the democratization of finance too lightly. It's incredibly important, and I think most of us at this conference, in this room, think that it's the right thing to do. But we should also bear in mind that it's a really very, very, very powerful set of tools, kind of influencing allocation of capital and influencing the kind of modulation of capital. And so I'll just mention one example from American financial history, which kind of shows the double-edged nature, especially of influencing allocation. Then we go to the Q&A. Perhaps the strongest bit of credit guidance in the American state after the end of World War II had to do, again, it was all around housing. Probably the single most important asset in any developed economy. And the strongest bit of credit guidance in the American post-war economy was probably redlining, which basically said, if you're black, you will not get access to credit to buy a house in most areas that are desirable. And so that created a spread between the project of black families trying to buy houses, who would struggle mightily to get access to that credit. They would have to pay extremely high interest rates, and everyone else, white Americans, who would get very cheap access to credit. And so the danger of democratizing finance is that through this tool, you can drive majority preferences far deeper into a social tissue than if you use blunter tools. You know, if you really influence these major financial flows, the spreads and the amounts of them, you end up acting on the social fabric as a whole. And so it's something that should be thought about, shouldn't be used lightly, but it's also something that is incredibly powerful. And when it comes, for example, to addressing sustainability, to kind of addressing the climate crisis, it's one of the tools we absolutely have to deploy. And again, then don't get lost in the details, don't kind of get confused by all the different kind of variants of sustainable finance, ESG and green spreads, all of that. Cut through that. It's allocation, it's modulation, it's spreads, it's kind of leverage. That's all that matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max, for kind of clearing up the jungle of sustainable finance into modulation and allocation. I think that was very helpful as kind of a tool to think about this. Maybe before you can ask questions again, the first question that came to my mind when I heard you speaking was, well then, who decides on the spreads, right? Or how can we design the process of deciding upon the spread with which or through which we want to allocate capital? Because I think this would then be a way of also combining democracy and the aim for sustainability in finance, right? So maybe you could comment a little bit more on that, how in practice this could be designed.
It's kind of a question about your question. Are you thinking about, is it kind of who should kind of decide the target distribution of spreads that we want to move our way towards? Or are you thinking about, okay, we've got a target distribution of spreads, these are the projects we want to push, and now the question is, who decides in practice, kind of what are the obstacles on the road to realizing the distribution of spreads? Is it kind of the first or the second?
I think both of them.
Okay, both. So on the first, how do we make this decision of, what financial landscape we want? I think it's a classic task for a democratic central government, because it's something that touches everyone in society. And given the kind of really fairly integrated global economy we have, in an ideal world, really, this is something where you would have, a democracy, a kind of democratic forum at the level of the kind of global division of labor. We don't have the political institutions for that, so it's very hard. But I would see something in the US. I think a more functional US Congress would be the right place to do this. In the European Union, God knows. I mean, anyway. But the basic idea is you want a kind of democratic body at the level of the economy to make the decision of what projects are we prioritizing. Okay. Then the second question, once you've kind of made these prioritizations, you've kind of outlined the vision of the economy you want, the enemy of implementation is arbitrage. Right, so let's say we want to push sustainable projects. So you kind of write down some criteria that tell you, okay, these projects are sustainable, renewable energy, renovating housing, sustainable agriculture, that sort of stuff. As soon as you make financing for that cheap, everyone is going to say, oh yeah, but this project actually falls under this kind of list of categories. And so then you need fairly classic enforcement, right? You need to think about this in the design of the criteria, because the more general they are, the easier it's going to do arbitrage and kind of do false labeling. But yeah, really, that's kind of, you need to look out for arbitrage and kind of prevent that.
Thank you. Okay, now we would open up to you again.
Hi Max. First of all, well done with your presentation, because that was so simple and well thought through. I have a question on the arbitrage. So yes, it results in a spread, but one aspect of the equation for the people doing the arbitrage is the risk. And in the sustainable finance conversation, at least in the EU, it's really all about, climate change will eventually blow up the planet, therefore it's a risk. And therefore we are going to try to measure that risk at each company level, even though we know it's a kind of systemic risk. So I mean, there are all flaws in this approach, I think. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about how you see that. And go back to your first point about different intentions resulting perhaps in different tools as well.
So thanks, that's a fantastic question, because I think you can say the following in response to it. So I think really what the European Commission is trying to do with its whole kind of range of sustainable finance stuff is really, it's just trying to make the financing of coal and gas and oil, it's trying to make that more expensive so that we get less of it, right? We should not be building any new fossil fuel infrastructure. It's just doesn't work relative to the planetary limits we're facing. But saying that outright and saying, look, we are going to do some credit guidance, we're going to divert credit flows away from fossil assets and towards renewable assets, would be way too controversial. So instead, they do exactly what you're saying. They kind of try to push the risk perception around these assets, right? So if you can get everyone to agree that these look like really risky assets, then the financial markets are going to say, well, okay, we might still finance this, but it's going to be really expensive in terms of interest rate, or you could even say, look, you're only allowed to finance this with equity finance and no longer with debt finance, which will change an awful lot. But I think really what's going on is we're hiding the true intention, because at the European level, there's not that much that you can say openly, and there's even less that you can do openly. And so, yeah, you end up using the tools you have.
Is there another question? Okay, yes.
So I have a question about, I mean, all of sustainable finance, as you pointed out, ESG in particular, is based around reducing financial risk, right? So the risk of the climate crisis to finance, and not the reverse, not the sort of risk that the financial system creates in climate. So when it comes to how lending decisions are made and the spreads, all of that is again based on the perceived risk of that, allocation. Do you think that there is a role in this just for, changing the risk framework, or also for sort of direct decisions that aren't based around the risk of a project, but just the kind of like, this is a value that we perceive to be necessary, this is something we think should be done, because that obviously would be pretty novel in terms of how the financial system operates. And yeah, do you think there's a place for that, and how might that work?
I definitely think there's a place for that. I think the way that we talk about sustainable finance so far is just literally going in the wrong direction, right? It cannot be about protecting the financial sector from the collapse of the world. It has to be about what needs to change in finance so the world doesn't collapse, right? So I acknowledge that people talk about sustainable finance in the first way. I also think they're wrong, and I talk about it in the second way, and I hope everyone else comes to that place. So completely agree with the first part. Second part, how would we then do that? I think there are a couple of fairly straightforward, if more or less aggressive things, but you could say, for example, okay, the first thing you need to be able to draw the distinction between sustainable and non-sustainable financial assets. And at the moment, we're doing this with kind of a lot of private sector ESG ratings, which are terrible and literally all over the map. This one. So this chart shows the correlation between the ESG ratings that different rating agencies give you, right? And so if they were good ratings, if they corresponded to something in reality, then if Bloomberg gives you an 80-point rating, then really the other ones should be at like maybe 79, maybe 83. So it should be fairly tightly clustered around the red line. As you can see, it's all over the map. So right now, we're not capable of identifying what investments, what financial products are sustainable or not. But that can be solved. The EU taxonomy is one way of solving that. If you've solved that problem, you can then do things like you go to the central bank, and the central bank says we will only accept financial assets as collateral in our repo transactions that are classified as sustainable. And that'll immediately drive up the risk on things that are not classified as sustainable. Or You can, in banking regulation, when you tell banks, all right, for different kinds of financial assets, you need to have different amounts of equity, of Eigenkapital. You can then tell banks, all right, if you want to finance something that's not on the list of sustainable assets, you're going to need an awful lot more of equity. And at the limit, I mean, you can say we want to be sustainable at the latest by 2050, probably 2040. So you could say today, the state will no longer enforce the property rights that sit behind financial assets that are not sustainable. Right? You could simply say, we will not tolerate this. And if you say that today, I can guarantee you the risk spreads on that are gonna they're gonna go up.
Okay, lovely. So, I mean, if there are no very important other questions, I think I would sum up the question now by saying that, yeah, thanking you all for this very visionary and interesting talks. I think we have a lot to think about. And yeah, and I think it just became very clear that we need to democratize our macroeconomic systems, but also asset management and yeah, ownership in general. So thank you very much for that. And I think there will be plenty of time to ask you other questions, maybe with a drink or some food. Thank you.